In 1990, the average Chinese citizen earned less than $1 a day. Today, China has more billionaires than any country except the United States. That's not a generation of gradual progress. That's a systemic rewiring of economic reality in 30 years. And if you think you understand how it happened, you probably don't. Because this isn't a story about hard work or innovation or free markets. It's a story about one of the most aggressive financial experiments in human history, and the bill is coming due. Let's start with what most people get wrong. When China opened up in the late 70s, the popular narrative is that Deng Xiaoping unleashed capitalism and everyone got rich. That's not what happened. What happened is that China built a controlled economic engine where the state decides who wins, who loses, and how fast the money moves. The wealth didn't trickle up through competition. It was architected from the top down. Here's the machine. First, China kept its currency artificially cheap. For decades, the yuan was pegged low against the dollar. This wasn't an accident, it was policy. A cheap currency made Chinese goods irresistible to the rest of the world. Factories exploded across the coast. Exports became the engine. By the early 2000s, China was the world's factory, and the trade surplus was pouring billions back into Beijing every single month. But here's where it gets interesting. Most countries would let that money circulate naturally. China didn't. The government funneled those dollars into massive infrastructure projects, highways, airports, entire cities built in under 5 years. This wasn't just construction, it was forced urbanization at a speed no one had ever attempted. Between 2000 and 2020, China poured more concrete than the United States did in the entire 20th century. Think about that for a second. And it worked, kind of. Urbanization created jobs, jobs created income, income created a consumer class. Within 20 years, hundreds of millions of people moved from rural poverty to urban middle class. The script was simple: move people into cities, give them factory work, build the infrastructure around them, repeat. It was Industrial Revolution speed run. But that's only half the story. Because while China was building, it was also borrowing, massively. Local governments took on debt to fund projects. State-owned enterprises took on debt to expand. Developers took on debt to build apartments no one needed yet. The entire system ran on leverage. And the central government let it happen because growth was the priority. Double-digit GDP growth every year. It became the legitimacy engine for the Communist Party. Growth equaled stability, stability equaled control. By 2008, when the global financial crisis hit, China didn't slow down, it doubled down. Beijing unleashed a stimulus package worth over $500 billion. Banks were told to lend, and they did. Money flooded into infrastructure again. More bridges, more trains, more ghost cities. Places like Ordos, built for 1 million people, sat nearly empty, but the GDP number kept climbing. Here's the uncomfortable math. A huge portion of that growth wasn't productive, it was just activity. Building things generated GDP whether or not anyone used them. And because local governments were judged on growth targets, they kept building. The incentive structure didn't care about efficiency, it cared about output. So you ended up with highways to nowhere, airports with no flights, entire districts with no residents. And all of it was financed with debt. By 2020, China's total debt to GDP ratio was over 280%. That's higher than the United States, higher than Japan before its lost decades. The difference is that most of that debt is domestic, held by state banks, which means Beijing controls the liability. But control doesn't mean it disappears. It just means the reckoning is delayed. Now add real estate. For the average Chinese family, wealth isn't in stocks or bonds, it's in property. About 70% of household wealth is tied in real estate. For years, property values only went up. People bought apartments not to live in, but as investments. Developers kept building because demand seemed endless. Local governments sold land to developers because land sales funded their budgets. It was a closed loop. Everyone made money as long as prices kept rising, until they didn't. In 2020, Beijing introduced the Three Red Lines policy, a cap on how much debt developers could carry. It was meant to cool the market. Instead, it triggered a slow-motion collapse. Evergrande, once the largest developer in China, defaulted on over $300 billion in liabilities. Other developers followed. Construction sites froze. Millions of families who had prepaid for apartments were left holding contracts for unfinished buildings. The wealth effect reversed. Property values stagnated, then fell. And because so much household wealth was in real estate, people started spending less. Consumption dropped. The engine that was supposed to carry China into the next phase, a consumption-driven economy, started sputtering. Meanwhile, the demographics turned hostile. China's working-age population peaked in 2015. It's been shrinking ever since. The one-child policy, in effect for over 30 years, created a generation imbalance. There aren't enough young workers to support the aging population, and the government knows this. They've tried to encourage more births. It hasn't worked. The fertility rate is now around one child per woman, well below replacement. So you have an economy built on debt-fueled growth, a real estate sector in crisis, and a shrinking workforce. The model that worked for 30 years doesn't work anymore. And here's the irony. China built wealth faster than any civilization in history, but speed has a cost. The inefficiencies, the bad loans, the empty cities, the over-leveraged system, all of it was tolerable when growth was 10% a year. At 3 or 4%, the cracks show. Beijing is trying to pivot. More focus on technology, self-sufficiency, domestic consumption. But pivoting a $17 trillion economy isn't like steering a startup. The inertia is massive. The vested interests are entrenched, and the global environment is less friendly than it was a decade ago. So what happens next? Maybe China manages a controlled slowdown, gradually deleverages, finds a sustainable growth path, manages the transition without a crisis? Or maybe the debt, the demographics, and the real estate collapse converge into something uglier, a prolonged stagnation, a sharp correction, something in between. No one knows for sure, not the analysts, not the party officials, not the families holding empty apartment keys. What we do know is this: China didn't build wealth the way we were told economies are supposed to work. It built wealth by bending the rules, controlling the variables, and moving faster than caution would allow. That worked until it didn't. And now the world is watching to see if the fastest economic rise in history can avoid becoming the most expensive lesson.